Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shelf Life. This is Simran, and this is my podcast where we talk about books, their philosophies, and most importantly, our personal relationship with the book. And last week, Mom and I did an episode on poetry, and I will tell you the story behind it because I think I do owe an explanation for it, for the audio quality being not up to the mark. So the truth of the matter is that we attempted to make a video for all your listeners, and we wanted to get visual as well as audio, but because of whatever reasons that didn't work out, so we just had audio, and the audio was a little sketchy because it was scam audio. So anyway, that's not the point, but the point is we're still gonna try and make that happen, and we're working on it. But we're just really thankful that y'all still stayed around. Y'all give so much love to that episode, and reading your comments and reading your feedback was really, again, every time you send in something, any message you send in about the podcast, I read everything, and it genuinely really helps me. It helps me to keep doing this. It helps me to stay focused, helps me to read, helps me to just keep going, and that's amazing. The fact that we have built a semblance of a community through books and through stories. I mean, it's really everything that I wanted to achieve through this podcast, and I'm really glad that that's happening for us, and we're gonna keep continuing to do that. And I'm just gonna keep saying this again and again. I'm sure you're pretty tired of hearing me say this, but if you know anyone who loves to read or who loves connecting with people, wants to be part of a community, especially community surrounding books and stories, send them this podcast. Tell them to be part of this community, because we want to build, we want to grow, and we are doing something that is important to us, and we would love to have more people on board. I mean, it's always a pleasure, right? So yeah, that's that. And moving on, we're going to be talking about something very interesting today, something that I deliberated a lot, and I came to the conclusion, I mean, let's just try it. I'm not sure how to go about this episode, because let me just tell you what it's about, okay? Today's episode is about the partition. And on a broader spectrum, it's about women, Indian women, writing about the partition and about independence, and writing from their perspective, because honestly, we see so much of the male perspective all around us, right? Everywhere. I'm not just talking about books. I'm talking about movies. I'm talking about the media, the news, everything. It is so dominated by the male species. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Of course not. But I think there's something that we're really missing when we don't listen to the female mind, to the female voice. We're really missing something when we don't pay attention to that side of the story. And I mean, let's be honest, we've historically done this, right? We've done this through political movements, we've done it in literature, we've done it in movies, we've done it everywhere. But this is something that I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about partition and the world of partition, and everything related to that. And I want to connect it directly to a book that I read, and I believe is the most beautiful book I've read related to this topic, related to the topic of partition. The most, fundamental, I think, base when you're talking about reading partition literature. I think you have to read this book. You have to at least start from here and then go on to so much more that's out there, right? So the book that I'm talking about is Pinjar. Pinjar by Amrita Pritam. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about this book. You have probably read it, or if you've not read it, if you're from perhaps the older generation. And I'm being very careful here. When I say older generation, I just mean older than me. And I am 19, so that's not a lot older than me. If you're a connoisseur of films, you've probably seen this one, because I think it won like 3 awards at the national awards when it was released. I'm not sure about the number of awards it won, but it won quite a lot. And it had Urmila Matondkar in it, and it was a great film, I think, from what I've heard of it. And the book, when I read it, of course, it's a translation that I read, but it really stayed with me. And I read it like 3 years ago, three or four. Yeah, I was 15, 16 years old when I read it. And it just came out of pure interest. I was enticed by the name. I didn't really know what Pinjar meant. I thought it meant a cage, but fun fact, it doesn't. Pinjar does not mean a cage, which is what I realized after I read the book. Anyway, I was very enticed by the name, and of course by the author's name. Amrita Pritam is a name that you don't miss. It doesn't matter what generation you belong to, you know who Amrita Pritam is. And if you don't, I really suggest that you go look her up, you listen to some of her poems. They're being recited by so many other people now, but you read some of those and you see her work and just what she stood for. It will resonate with you, and if you're a woman, of course it will. I know it will. That was my main motive behind it. But before I get into Pinjar, right, before we get into what I wanted to talk about, and just the little tiny details of the book and everything, I want to discuss a little bit of a story with you, right? We've done 13 episodes now, right? We've come a long way. we talk about a lot of things here, and I feel like I've gotten to know all of you better. From the feedback that you send in, I've gotten to know your minds a little bit more. And I want to believe that you know me a little bit better too, right? Through this format, and hopefully through a better format in the future. Not hinting at anything, but anyway. So I want to tell you a little bit more. I want to let you in on some more stories, okay? So the first time I learned about the partition, right? And it was not the first time I learned about Independence Day. Fun fact, you do not learn about the partition the same time you learn about Independence Day. And I'm sure that's true for most of us, right? Unless we come from families that have perhaps, personally witnessed the partition or have been a part of it, been victims of it or survivors of it rather. Unless you've been personally affected by it, probably you don't join the two, right? And the first time that I was thinking about, I was thinking about this the other day. When was the first time I learned about the partition? And what is my connection to that event in history and everything that surrounds it, everything that followed it or precedes it? Where do I stand with that? And of course, I went back to I've spoken a lot about this with my grandmother, who I'm very fond of, and it's so beautiful because she listens to all of these episodes, and she keeps telling me that she doesn't really understand what it's about, but she loves listening to my voice, and I think that's just the most beautiful thing ever. But I'm diverting from the topic here. When I asked her, and whenever I've asked either of my grandparents, right, both sides, whenever I've asked them about, did you know anything about the freedom struggle? Did you know anything about the movement? Did you know the leaders? How was it like living in colonial India, right? I think, especially with me, I think I've always had a little bit of a fancy for that. I've I do feel like I exoticize it a little bit. The fact that, you know, there was a time when we were colonized. There was a time when there was a very obvious enemy to our freedom, and a very obvious enemy that we had to fight to establish our nationalism, our nationalistic abilities, and our patriotism, right? Which is something that we don't see today. I mean, today the obvious enemy is not obvious. Today there are multiple factors that test our nationalism, right? Even the meaning of the word nationalism is so distorted and so confusing. Anyway, again, diverting from the topic here. But I asked my grandmother, and I used to do this a lot when I was a kid. I used to ask her, you know, what was your experience like? How was it like living there? Did you meet any British people? Did you see any freedom? Did you see any of the movements? Did you see anything happening around you? And I remember being extremely disappointed that my grandmother had no specific relationship with the freedom movement. And because she would tell me, I don't really remember much of it. I don't, I haven't really been through a lot of that movement or been part of that movement. But she always told me this one story, that the biggest thing for her when she was a child was that this one time, I think maybe Nehruji or Mahatma Ji, one of them or one of the leaders had passed by her village, and she remembers seeing them from afar, and that's the only thing she remembers about the freedom movement and all of that. And I realized that was such an interesting thing that, I mean, she was very young while it happened, but the fact that you have such a small memory, such a simple memory of a movement of that size, that much significance that it has today, the fact that you attach it all to just that one memory, it's so funny, so many big events happen in our lives, and what we remember of it after they pass is sometimes so small and so random. And honestly, it really is. It really is just inexplicable. And I remember that, the reason why she told me that she didn't have that much of a connect with the freedom movement, and with the whole colonization scene as a whole, right, was because she lived in the village. She came from a small little village in Karnataka, and she lived with her grandmother when she was really young, and then she moved to live with her parents in Bombay, and her father was a playwright and all of those things, right? There were a lot of factors that didn't connect her to that movement in particular. And that really made me feel like, it reminded me of something that I feel like I've, deliberated over a lot in my life, which is that there are all of these movements, there are all of these events in history that I don't feel particularly connected to because of where I come from, because of where my ancestors have come from. So, for example, because my grandmother has no, distinct memories of the partition, and had nothing essentially to do with that movement, I feel like perhaps I am stripped of some kind of a heroic story or heroic identity. I feel sometimes, I used to feel it, especially when I was a little bit a little while ago, not very long while ago, I used to feel almost stripped of an identity, a reason for being. People have all these stories about how their parents or their grandparents or their great grandparents, they fought in these wars, or they had these, diaries that they would write in. They would have all these revolutionary thoughts and whatnot, right? There are all these stories that you have about your ancestors that somehow managed to shape who you are. And I always felt a little devoid of that because of this reason, because I felt like my ancestors came from a little village in Karnataka, weren't really connected to the mainland as such. Even after they moved to Bombay, both sets of my grandparents moved to Bombay, they weren't really attached to any of the Bombay culture, as you may say, as you may call it, right? They weren't part of that scene, if I have to use today's lingo. So I think that element, that feeling of being a little bit left out, that comes from something that you probably can't even control. And that element is something that I wanted to talk about, because we take it for granted that people have all of these memories related to the partition, that people remember it as this and that, and they have all these distinct, they have like a relationship with partition, but there are also a lot of people who don't have that. And how do you form that relationship with something that you don't connect to, that you've never known? How do you form that? How do you build that? And that I did, that element, that feeling, I had taken to this book. When I started reading this book, I came to this book with that feeling. And when I opened Pinjar, it was a world I didn't know. Now, let me introduce Pinjar and its world to you. Pinjar is a story about a young Hindu girl who lives in a village near the border, and she's Punjabi, right? And she is betrothed to a man of her own community. She is seen as a burden by her family. And she knows that she is, but she accepts it. And she is betrothed to a man and ready to be married off and, gotten rid of, in a sense. But then communal riots break out, and she is abducted by a Muslim boy, Rashid. And then a lot of things happen in the story. She escapes. She goes back to her family. They disown her. And essentially what happens, the focal point of the book, the fulcrum of the book, is when she has to marry her abductor. She has to marry Rashid, the man who abducted her, the Muslim boy who abducted her. And she has to essentially change her identity. She becomes, from Paro, she becomes Hamida. She changes her name. She has a new family. She has a new everything. And she becomes essentially a new person. And she sees the world around her crumble. She sees riots break out. She sees so many women who have to face the same struggle and who are being treated as commodities, Either they are being sold off as honor or jewelry, or they are being treated as commonplace, as commodities that can be gotten rid of at any moment, at any time, that can be used as a tool while fighting war, so as bait, essentially, while fighting war. So that is something that that Pinjar deals with a lot, and it talks about that aspect of partition, the fact that there were so many women who were being abducted and raped and killed, and all in the name of religion and all in the name of honor and whatnot, right? And there are so many stories about women who survived that, but what was left of them after they survived. And I want to read a little excerpt here from, this is not Pinjar, but this is another one of Amrita Pritam's brilliant writing, and I want to talk about that. And here's how it goes. Okay, this really struck to me. This is how the story starts. Woman is the world's greatest smuggler. A man might smuggle out opium and marijuana, or at best gold, or the secrets of a government. That's all. Nothing further. But a woman can smuggle a man's complete existence. So long as she can, she smuggles and conceals it deep down in her womb. And this is from a story called That Man. If you want to read it, you can always check that out. But I just wanted to read this little excerpt out for you because I think it's so powerful to pose women as smugglers. You know, and the idea that we associate women with so many things, right? We associate them with, like I said, honor, with pride, with sometimes weakness, most of the times weakness, with fragility, with being delicate. All of these adjectives that we use to describe women, that we associate women with. But only Amrita Pritam can possibly associate smuggling with being a woman. And it's so perfect because it essentially puts them on a higher pedestal, but at the same time also deviates them. And it's just writing wise, I mean, as a writer, I appreciate this excerpt so much because to think of something like this is absolutely genius. And again, I want to remind you, in case you can't picture it, Amrita Pritam was writing in the 40s and 50s, right? 50s and 60s. She published it in 50s and 60s, and she was probably writing from, when she was a kid. So this was many, many years ago, 70 plus years ago. And for a woman to be writing about all of these things back then, it meant something completely different than what it means now, right? Another example I want to give you of some absolutely insane writing by a woman who belonged to a time where you couldn't have possibly imagined her to be writing what she did. And also, funnily enough, another piece of really great Indian feminist writing. It's controversial, but and it is debated upon if you can call it feministic or not. But again, I think I'm going to leave that up to you. You should probably decide that on your own. It's called Lihaf by Ismat Chugtai. It's a beautiful short story, and essentially what it talks about is a situation where the woman is the assaulter in a sense. But again, that the fact that she's an assaulter, that comes into picture because of a lot of other things. She has her reasons, blah blah blah, but that is essentially what it deals with, the idea of a woman taking advantage of someone she should not be taking advantage of. And it was really interesting for me to read these two pieces of literature, which are set in partition time. They are set during partition or pre-partition, and they are, they were written in a time when women were constantly being assaulted. Their bodies were being encroached upon. Their minds were being subjugated. Their spirits were being drowned. This is a time where women suffered the most, right? Because they were considered the most vulnerable. And if we read, if we get history right, which I hope we do, and which I'm sure a lot of people are trying to prove wrong, but if we get history right, we will know this, that whenever there's a revolution, whenever there is a a huge war, whenever there's any massive change that has to come, or that is coming, it's always the women who have the mightiest stories to tell, because it is always them who suffer the most. And I'm not making too much of a statement here. I'm not exaggerating, but it is the truth. And you see that there, even when they existed in a time like this, right? When there was so much turmoil going on. Amrita Pritam used to live in Lahore, and she had to move to Delhi during the partition because the riots had broken out, and she was just not safe there anymore. And she had to flee her village with her children, and to think that she was writing in a time when there was possibly no paper to write on. She was writing in a time when you couldn't write. There was no reason to write, because there was so much going on. And even Ismat Chugta, it was the fact that she wrote Lihaf when she did. And the fact that there's such a huge difference, there was such a huge difference even then in the idea with the idea of what feminism means. For Ismat Chugta, perhaps feminism meant the woman being in a position previously or, more usually held by men, right? Even if that means taking the position of an assaulter, taking the position of the exploiter, even if it means that. But for Amrita Pritam, she talks about how much assault happened on the woman. And it's not just on the body, because when we talk about assault on women, we only talk about the body. Let's be honest. We talk about the body more than we talk about the mind. And what Amrita Pritam does through Pinjar and through most of her stories, because she's written countless of them, and I urge you to check all of it out. What she does through her story, through Pinjar, is that she shows you that there is a difference in there being an assault on the body and there being assault on the mind. And in Pinjar, she shows that the woman at the center of it, Paro, she is being assaulted in both ways. And it's really interesting to see that, the changes that Paro goes through, the fact that she has to change her entire identity, that in itself is genius writing, because that is a metaphor for the country that Amrita Pritam was living in, the time that Amrita Pritam was living in, right? India was a country that went from being United India, British India, to being India and Pakistan, to then being India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Amrita Pritam lived in a time when she saw a loss of identity happen to an entire nation, to an entire region of people, an entire race of people. She saw it happen with her own eyes. She experienced it. And we can't possibly imagine that, right? Of course, there's so many instances of loss of identity happening today. But through Pinjar, Amrita Pritam shows that the struggle that the country went through as well, the fact that the country was assaulted as well, body and mind, land and spirit. The country was assaulted, the country was exploited, the country was torn apart, and then the country had two identities. One Muslim, one Hindu, and countless others, right? All marginalized, all subjugated, all trying to have a voice. So it's really interesting when you read stories from the partition, because they tell you so much about the time that they were written in and the person who was writing it. And Pinjar, again, Pinjar is a book that is so complex in the fact that there is no right or wrong. And Pritam makes it so clear there is no right or wrong. Even her abductor, even the character of Rashid, who becomes her husband, is shown to have a very guilty conscience. He is shown to have some sort of toxicity in him that you can sympathize with, that you can probably comprehend with compassion, is what I call it. This is something that something that I have done with a lot of these books that I read, where I see a character, where I meet a character that I can't completely sympathize with because of how they are, because of what they've done or whatever, but I can at least understand them. I can at least comprehend with compassion. That's the term I've given to it, and you are free to use it. I have absolutely no issues, but that's what I'm saying, that even that character is someone that you can comprehend, and that's so crazy to do. I mean, can you imagine relating to an abductor? Can you imagine even just having any bit of compassion for him? But you actually do. You actually understand why. I don't want to ruin the book for you, so I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end. But you understand why he is the way that he is. And so much of it has to do with people that you don't even know personally. And I'm a history student. I am told this so many times in class, that the partition, the so many major events that happen in history, right? Take the revolution, take the Blue Star operation, whatever. I'm just like spitballing here. I don't know if that's the right word. Anyway, I'm just thinking of whatever big events have happened in the past. All of them have been taken by these few people. Most of the times they are men. And they're taken by these few individuals who decide, as representatives of maybe an entire community, an entire gender, or whatever it is, right? And we only associate our largest passions and desires and ambitions and our purpose for living, and our purpose to fight for ourselves with those individuals. Take Mahatma, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, we associate, so many people of that time associated their lives, their reasons for living, their purposes for existence with just that man and his ideology. The same goes with someone like Jinnah, perhaps. And it's so insane. And I want to connect that directly to that story that my grandmother told me. That everything that she remembers about the independence struggle, the partition, everything boils down to just one figure who crossed by her village one evening or one morning or whenever he did. You boil an entire movement down to one person. And I know that it's kind of contradictory to talk about that while I'm talking about how Amrita Pritam and Ismat Chugtai are essentially representatives of all the women who lived during partition time. But they're not, and I admit that, which is why I wanted to take Ismat Chugtai up, because she presents a very different view from what Pritam does, right? It's a proper contrast. Two completely different perspectives. But they're both valid. They both exist. They're both remembered. They're both understood. And it's so important that we do that. It's so important that all of these perspectives exist. Even those people who don't remember the partition, who don't connect to the partition, who have to read books to connect with this event in history, even those people, their stories are valid. Their stories deserve to be heard. And I'm not just saying that to defend myself. I genuinely mean that. I think that my grandmother and her ancestors, they lived some absolutely insane lives. And they do have some absolutely insane stories to tell. And sure, they don't always have a lot to do with the political movements of the time or the partition, but there are still stories to tell. They're still human stories. They're still stories of loss, of love, of hope, of perseverance, of assault, of just faith. Faith. They're stories of faith. And I know that this episode was a little bit different. It was a little just story oriented, me talking about the story more than I talked about the book. But I wanted to do that. I wanted to dedicate this episode to just discussing how do you think about the things that you think about. And I know that sounds so lofty, but genuinely sit down and consider this. Why do you think about the things the way that you think about them? Why are you connected to some things more than you are to others? Why are you not connected to some things more than you are to others? Think about that. And coming to the end of our podcast, coming to the last question, why do we think this story was told? Because honestly, I think it's time we make that distinction between Independence Day and Partition Day. I think it's important we make that distinction between a new country being born and all of those celebrations and a country being torn apart into two, literally. I think it's important that we remember that story as well, that side as well. Just as we remember the side of the women, just as we need to remember the side of the people who didn't experience or didn't bear the brunt of the partition. They're all valid, they're all important, they all matter. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm going to see you next time.
I'm all alone in this dreadful place, and I can't stop.